Hello Anglophonians, and welcome to another episode where we take a look at European comic culture. And this time it's something new, a new series. Well, okay, it's not new in a sense of that it's actually pretty old, but in this series it's new. The series is called Johan and Pewitt, and it is, so to speak, the, well, prequel to the Smurfs. I think the creator of the Smurfs and of Johan and Pewitt, Peyo, wouldn't like it if I said this, so let's not call it a prequel. Johan and Pewitt was its own story, but, well, not as successful as the Smurfs should turn out. But we are now looking into the first story, and in the first story, no surprise, there are no Smurfs, and there's not even Pewitt. Pewitt is a secondary character that will come in later. For now, Johan is on his own in the story Basenhau's Punishment. Since this is a comic in French, the name is probably pronounced Basenhau. But before we delve into this story, let's look at Johan's origins, which were not where he would later have great success. Let's even start at the very beginning, with the artist who invented Johan, and later Pewitt, the Brussels comic artist Pierre Culliford, aka Peyo. Pierre was born on June 25, 1928, the last of Richard and Marguerite Culliford's 3 children. He was a sporty child, but was also interested in drawing at an early age. He drew a lot, even in class when he was bored. But when he was 15, his father died. He had to take a job to earn money for the family. He worked in a cinema in Brussels and came in contact with many films that inspired his later comics. After the end of the German occupation, Pierre was just 17 years old and applied to a Belgian animation company. And in fact, he was hired. At the animation company, he got to know other artists who would later make a name for themselves. Maurice de Beauvais, who would invent the cowboy Lucky Luke under the alias Morris. André Franquin, who would later take over the comic series Spirou, as well as Géo Salmon and Eddie Pape. Around the same time, Pierre's alias Peyo was created. Or let's say that the name had come into being earlier, but at that time Pierre Culliford began to sign his works with this name. But why an alias at all? Culliford was an unusual name for a Belgian, because it wasn't actually Belgian. The family originally came from England, so the correct name is Culliford. But Pierre remembered a little cousin. This cousin had some difficulty correctly pronouncing Pierre's nickname, Pierrot, which means Little Peter. Instead of Pierrot, the cousin said something like Peyo, and this is how the alias came about. Peyo was still working on a project for which he designed small goblins, a concept he would revisit years later. However, before the film could be produced, the animation company went bankrupt in 1946. Maurice de Beauvais and André Franquin went to the Dupuis publishing house and worked for the comic magazine Spirou, but Peyo first went to the Academy of Arts in Brussels. Parallel to his studies, Peyo drew comics, which he initially published in the supplement of the daily newspaper L'Occident. Eventually, he worked for the youth supplement of the newspaper Les Dernières Heures. He drew a comic with the adventures of a page he calls Johan. Back then, the comics were still published in black and white, and Peyo's drawing style wasn't fully developed yet, but things were moving forward. He drew the adventures from 1946 to 1951, before the youth supplement of Le Dernier Heure was discontinued. First, Johan was able to experience his adventures at the supplement of the newspaper Le Soir, before Peyo was hired by Dupuis, thanks to the advocacy of his friend André Franquin, and he worked for the comic magazine Spirou. This meant that the format of his story had to change, which had previously been more like comic strips. The first story for Spirou magazine was intended to be a 44-page serialized stories, as was common practice at the time. Finally, on September 11th, 1952, in Spirou magazine number 752, the first episode of the adventure Basenhau's Punishment was published. In addition to the format, two things had changed. For one thing, the hero of the series, Johan, was no longer blonde, but had black hair. On the other hand, the adventures were now in color, and Peyo's future wife, Nine, made sure of that. She was the colorist for the story. Almost a year after the beginning, in Spirou number 794 of July 2nd, 1953, Basenhau's Punishment came to an end. The story begins in the castle where Johan works as a page. The king, who always remains nameless in these stories, has planned a great tournament. One participant is the skilled knight Count Tremaine. When Johan goes to get Tremaine's lance, he discovers Tremaine's competitor, Count Basenhau, who is currently sawing Tremaine's lance so it breaks in the tournament. Tremaine decides to teach Basenhau a lesson the next day. He takes part in the tournament and he defeats Basenhau in the joust, because Tremaine's lance does not break as expected. Tremaine exposes Basenhau in front of everyone watching and the king by telling what Basenhau was planning. Basenhau is then banished by the king. A few days later, a wandering bard comes to the king's castle and appears suspicious to Johan. And Johan is right. The bard is a spy for Count Basenhau. Basenhau has sworn revenge. The spy should tell him how best to conquer the king's castle. At this point, a small insert. The king gets the information from the spy by sending him to the torture chamber. The Belgian censors found the torture scene too scary for children, so a piece had to be removed. Anyway, Johan offers himself as a decoy. He goes to Basenhau's castle and claims to have been sent by the spy. He also finds out exactly what Basenhau is planning. But now he has to get out of the castle and escape Basenhau's guards to warn Count Tremaine and the king. Basenhau's Punishment is a straight adventure story. There are no twists in the plot, but Peyo tells a very exciting story of how Johan first catches and arrests the spy and later escapes from Basenhau's castle to warn his king. As already noted, the king in the series has no name, and even his kingdom remains unnamed. However, from the architecture and the clothes people wear, we can assume that it is a Central European medieval kingdom. Perhaps a romanticized version of a medieval Belgium. One can tell in the story that Peyo still had to find the balance between tension and humor. There are some humorous scenes, but not as developed as later. Especially when Johan's sidekick Pewitt comes along, the humor increases. And less than 2 months after the story ended, a new one began. But this is another story, and will be told another time. So there you have it. This was the first story of Johan without Pewitt. Now we get to him, don't worry. But for today, that's all. Next time we take another look at the Europa Park and then at another comic. Until then, take good care of yourself and see you.